When we arrived in Mileston, we came into the heart of Holmes County's civil rights activities. 2 years earlier, in 1962, a number of Holmes County black farmers had begun taking steps of their own that joined them to the struggle already sweeping the South. A few at a time, the Holmes farmers made bold journeys on remote roads where being seen, stopped, and identified with organizing could bring physical and economic harm. They requested that organizers come to Mileston to help set up a meeting there. Jack and Mattie Louie, a farming couple living on the land of the former plantation Marcella, opened up their home to John Ball, a young Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or SNCC organizer. By early March 1963, the essentials of a meeting place, local leaders, and at least one outside organizer were all falling into place for the first Mileston meeting. Varying numbers attended the weekly voter education meetings at the Mileston Sanctified Church. Then on Monday, April 8, 1963, perhaps as many as 40 attended the meeting. They decided to make their first attempt to that is, register to vote, the next day at the courthouse in the Holmes County seat of Lexington. At least 25 volunteered to meet and drive there together, a historic action for Holmes. The next morning, only 14 of those who had promised showed up. They became known as the First 14. In Holmes and most other Mississippi counties at that time, less than a handful of Negroes had been passed by the white voter registration clerks and listed in the county registration books. Those circuit clerks held the fort against what must have felt like a black onslaught. Facing Holmes's 72% black population, Circuit Clerk Henry B. McClellan used a 21-question registration form, complete with a question asking for an interpretation of a section of the Mississippi Constitution. He was strict for blacks, but offered help for whites. Even before getting the form, a Negro had to screw up the courage to approach the courthouse. Simply asking for the right to vote was an almost revolutionary step. If successful, the results would ultimately bring voting power to the majority. But the system had been denying blacks their voting rights, oppressing them and stifling them in most every arena for hundreds of years. Approaching the courthouse marked a person as a troublemaker who wanted to wreak havoc on the white system. Many in Mississippi in the 1950s and 1960s had already been beaten and even murdered for trying to register to vote. Even up to 1963, whites tried to keep registering a secret from the black community. Those who did know about it knew it was risky, but even as those at the first Mileston meeting knew that asking for registration papers was dangerous, they were learning how to fill them out. Holmes County had more independent black landowners than any other county in the state, more than 800. Also unusual was that more than 100 of those farms were in the rich Delta land, which had come about through a Roosevelt-era program that broke up several plantations into plots sold on long-term, low-interest loans with a house, barn, mules, and tools. Most of the first 14 had been living and growing their land and families on those Farmers Home Administration FHA project farms since the late 1930s. So on April 9, the next morning after the big meeting, those 14 farmers who were determined to try to reddish, and several more who went as drivers, pulled up onto the highway from where they'd met at Ozell and Annie Bell Mitchell's home. The cars headed the 17 miles northeast to the courthouse. All were local Holmes residents. Only John Ball, the one SNCC organizer, joined the 14 local farmers that morning. High Sheriff Andrew P. Smith was waiting on the courthouse steps with his auxiliaries. the 30 men he deputized that morning after getting U.S. Justice Department notice that the SNCC organizers had requested federal protection for the registration attempts in Lexington. Smith confronted the group of blacks and asked what they thought they were doing. Turnbow was in no more of a leadership position than any of the others, but without a prior plan, he stepped forward and said, "We's come to reddish." Then Smith asked which one was going first. Turnbow later explained, when the sheriff put his one hand on that blackjack and the other one on that gun and raised his voice, then that 13 wanted to run, but running wasn't for them. They managed to stay. I got them out of struggling and relieved them when I stepped out there and said, "I'll be first." Hartman Turnbow. Turnbow was allowed to enter the circuit clerk's office, but he didn't receive registration forms before the office closed at noon for dinner. The group waited under the big tree on the courthouse lawn near the Confederate monument for that afternoon and over the next 2, some say 3 days before they were let in. Each was called one at a time, shown the test forms, and then berated by the circuit clerk. Lexington's weekly newspaper, the Holmes County Herald, covered the attempt on its front page. The paper ran a big headline, "Quiet Prevails After Tense Situation," and published photos and interviews of most of the first 14 blacks. About half of the group, Alma Carnegie Mitchell, Sam Redmond, John Daniel Wesley, Reverend Jesse James Russell, Rosebud Clark, and Hartman Turnbow, were pictured in 4 large photographs along the bottom of the front page. The other members of the first 14 were Annabelle Mitchell, Charlie Carnegie, Norman Clark, Chester Hayes, Ralphus Hayes, Jack Louie, Ozell Mitchell, and Joe T. Mitchell. Negroes weren't usually seen in the Herald's pages unless they had violated some rule. Such coverage was not positive publicity. It was dangerous business for those beginners in movement action. Everyone's name was printed in the news story. From then on, every week, a circuit clerk's list of all who tried to register was printed in the Herald, thus announcing to the local whites, creditors, suppliers, and employers just who should be targeted for reprisals. Soon after those first movement actors finished their courthouse vigil and returned to their farms, night riders drove onto Turnbow's place on the main U.S. Highway 49. They threw firebombs and fired rifle shots into the house where Turnbow, his wife, and his teenage daughter were sleeping. In a bold and important action, Turnbow leapt out of his bed, grabbed his rifle, and shot back. The whites scattered. Some say a few were hit, and one was killed. The Turnbow family was uninjured. They pumped and hauled water from outside to put out the fire caused by the firebombs. The sheriff returned. Many believed he was one of the night riders, and arrested Turnbow for arson of his own home, along with SNCC organizer Bob Moses, who was documenting the damages. In those times in Mississippi, blacks and movement whites were often jailed on ridiculous charges. In spite of the night riders, the first organized action was a victory. None of the first 14 had been physically hurt or killed, the definition of victory at that time and place. Meet, plan, then take the action brought their real success. They had known it wouldn't be easy. For Turnbow, the arson attack on his home, and then his arrest and jailing for arson of his own house, was terrifying. He felt the effect was the reverse of the night rider's intention, and Turnbow said, "They set my house on fire, but that just stirred it up. It made it worse. It just made a bigger fire. Them people that done it, they thought if they burned me out, it would just squash it. But it made it worser." Everybody then was determined to go reddish. They poured out, didn't care what it cost. They go and do it. Despite the danger, fear, and harassment, The milestone first movers felt victory in taking those steps together. They had planned and carried out an action. They knew the replication of such actions throughout Holmes County and the state and the South, piece by piece, would wear away at the system that barred them from voting, and so much more.